There is a moment that happens right before every bad decision you have ever made. It is so small, so fast, that most people never even notice it is there. It is the moment between something happening and you reacting to it. Someone says something cruel, and before you even think, your face is hot and your words are already spilling out. Your business partner cancels the deal, and before you can stop yourself, you are firing off a message you will regret in an hour. Someone you love pulls away, and before you can breathe, you are chasing, pleading, gripping tighter. In that tiny gap between event and reaction, your entire life is being written, and almost nobody controls it. Almost nobody even knows it exists. This audiobook is about that gap. It is about what happens when you finally learn to own it instead of being owned by it. We are going to talk about a skill that the most powerful, most respected, most quietly dangerous people in every field share in common. Whether they are closing billion-dollar deals, leading armies, running households, or simply walking through life without ever seeming to be knocked off balance. That skill is emotional detachment, and I want to tell you right now, it is not what you think it is. You have probably been told that detachment means not caring, that it means becoming cold, distant, robotic, shutting the door on your own heart, so nothing can hurt you anymore. Forget that definition. Throw it away. Real emotional detachment is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of control. It is the ability to feel everything fully. The rage, the heartbreak, the fear, the temptation, and still choose your response instead of being dragged by it like a dog on a leash. The people who have mastered this are not empty. They are the opposite of empty. They are so full of self-command that nothing on the outside can reach in and steal the wheel from them. Think about the people you admire most. The leader who stays calm while everyone else is panicking. The negotiator who doesn't flinch when the other side tries to provoke them. The person who can walk away from a toxic relationship without begging, without collapsing, without giving away one more piece of themselves. What do they all have in common? They are not immune to emotion. They have simply built a wall between what they feel and what they do. And inside that wall is where all of their power lives. By the time you finish this audiobook, you will understand exactly how that wall is built, brick by brick, and you will have the tools to start building your own. You will learn why the calmest person in any room is always the most dangerous one. You will learn how detachment protects your decisions, your relationships, your career, and your self-respect. You will learn the difference between healthy detachment and the kind of avoidance that quietly destroys people from the inside. And you will learn, step by step, how to practice this skill in your own life until it becomes second nature. This is not about becoming someone who doesn't care. This is about becoming someone who cannot be controlled. Someone whose peace does not depend on what other people say, do, or take away. Someone who can lose a deal, lose an argument, lose a relationship, and still walk away, standing tall, because their sense of self was never tied to any of it in the first place. That is what unstoppable actually looks like, and it starts in this next chapter with a single question. What is emotional detachment, really? And why have you been lied to about it your whole life? Chapter 1. What emotional detachment really is. Let's start by clearing away the wreckage of a bad idea, because most people walk around with a completely broken definition of detachment, and that broken definition is exactly what keeps them trapped in emotional chaos for their entire lives. When most people hear the word detachment, their mind goes straight to something cold. They picture someone who doesn't cry at funerals, someone who shrugs when a relationship ends, someone who seems incapable of love or warmth. They picture the emotionally unavailable partner, the distant parent, the boss who never says a kind word. That picture is not detachment. That picture is a wound wearing a mask, and it has nothing to do with what we are talking about in this audiobook. Real emotional detachment is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of distance between you and your emotion. Just enough distance that the emotion cannot make your decisions for you anymore. Imagine standing next to a river instead of standing in it. You can still see the water, hear it, feel the mist on your face, know exactly how fast and how cold it is. But you are not being swept downstream by it. You have a vantage point. You have choice. That is the entire difference. The person drowning in the river and the person standing calmly on the bank both know the river is there. Only one of them is being controlled by it. This is why the healthiest, most emotionally intelligent people you will ever meet are almost never the ones who feel the least. They are often the ones who feel the most, but who have built the internal architecture to hold those feelings without being ruled by them. A grieving person who has mastered emotional detachment does not feel less grief. They feel the full weight of it. And they also retain the ability to keep functioning, to make sound decisions, to show up for the people who need them, because their grief has not become the pilot of their life. It has become a passenger they are aware of, but not the one steering the car. Consider the difference between reacting and responding, because this is the mechanical heart of everything we are going to build in this audiobook. A reaction is instant, automatic, unfiltered. It comes from the oldest part of your brain, the part that evolved to keep you alive when a predator jumped out of the bushes, not the part that evolved to negotiate a salary or navigate a difficult conversation with your spouse. A reaction bypasses your judgment entirely. It fires before you even know it's happening. And by the time you notice, the words are already out of your mouth, or the money is already spent, or the relationship is already damaged. A response, on the other hand, is what happens when there is space between the trigger and the action. It is slower, sometimes only by a second or two, but that second is everything. In that second, you get to ask yourself what actually serves you here. Not what feels satisfying in this instant, but what actually moves you toward the life you are trying to build. Emotional detachment is the skill of manufacturing that second over and over in every high-pressure moment of your life until it becomes so automatic that people start calling you unshakable. Here is something that surprises most people the first time they hear it. Detachment is not the opposite of love, and it is not the opposite of passion. In fact, the people who are capable of the deepest love and the most intense passion are often the ones who have the strongest emotional detachment, because detachment is what allows them to love without becoming dependent, to feel passion without being reckless, to care deeply about outcomes without needing those outcomes to survive. A person with no detachment loves in a way that is really just fear wearing the costume of affection. They cling because losing the other person feels like losing themselves. A person with real detachment loves freely because their sense of self was never outsourced to another human being in the first place. The same principle applies to ambition. You can want something with your entire chest. You can work relentlessly toward a goal and still hold enough internal distance that if it doesn't work out, you are not destroyed. That is not contradiction. That is maturity. The entrepreneur who pours everything into a business but can survive its failure without losing their identity. The athlete who trains with total intensity but can lose a championship without spiraling into worthlessness. These people are not less driven than everyone else. They are more free because their drive is not chained to a single outcome for its meaning. I want you to sit with a distinction that will change how you interpret every emotionally intense moment for the rest of your life. There is a difference between not caring and not needing. Not caring is numbness. It is a defense mechanism built from pain, and it usually collapses the moment real pressure is applied, revealing all the unprocessed hurt underneath. Not needing is strength. It is the quiet knowledge that you would prefer a certain outcome. You would be glad to have it, and you would still be whole without it. Everything we are building in this audiobook points toward that second state. Preference without dependence. Desire without desperation. Full feeling without total control being handed over to that feeling. By the end of this audiobook, you are going to understand exactly how to cultivate that state in every area of your life. Your relationships, your work, your conflicts, your ambitions. But before we get to the how, we need to understand the why. And specifically, we need to understand why so many people never develop this skill at all. Why do most human beings go their entire lives being yanked around by every emotional gust of wind that blows through their day? That is exactly what the next chapter is going to expose. Because once you see it clearly, you will never be able to unsee it in yourself or in anyone around you. Chapter 2. Why most people are emotional prisoners. Here is an uncomfortable truth that almost nobody wants to hear. So I am going to say it plainly and let you sit with it. Most people are not actually making decisions with their own mind. They are making decisions with whatever emotion happened to be loudest in the room at that moment. Anger decides who they text at midnight. Fear decides which opportunities they never pursue. Jealousy decides how they treat the people who love them. Insecurity decides what they buy, what they post, who they compare themselves to. The average person spends their entire life believing they are the author of their choices, when in reality, they are simply transcribing whatever their most recent emotional spike told them to do. This is not a character flaw. It is not stupidity. It is biology combined with a complete absence of training. Nobody sits down with children and teaches them how to create distance between a feeling and an action. Nobody explains that anger is information, not instruction. Nobody explains that the anxious thought spiraling through your head at 2 in the morning is not a prophecy. It is just neurons firing in a pattern shaped by fear. Instead, most people grow up learning the opposite lesson by example. They watch the adults around them react instantly to every provocation, and they absorb the belief that this is simply what it means to be human. Feel it, do it. Feel it, say it. Feel it, become it. Think about how this plays out across an entire life. Someone gets a slightly critical comment at work and spends the rest of the day rehearsing arguments in their head, snapping at their family that evening, sleeping poorly, and showing up exhausted and irritable the next day, all triggered by 6 seconds of someone else's words. Someone gets ghosted by a person they went on 2 dates with and spirals into questioning their entire worth as a human being for the next 2 weeks. Someone sees a former classmate post a picture of a new house and feels a wave of bitterness that quietly poisons their mood for the rest of the afternoon. None of these people are broken. They are simply untrained. They have never learned that they get to choose what an emotion is allowed to do inside them. There is a reason this pattern is so universal, and it goes back further than any individual childhood. Your brain was not built for the modern world. It was built over hundreds of thousands of years for a world of immediate physical threats, where hesitation could mean death and instant reaction could mean survival. The amygdala, the small almond-shaped structure buried deep in your brain, does not know the difference between a predator crouched in the grass and an unanswered text message. It fires the same alarm, floods you with the same stress chemicals, prepares your body for the same fight or flight response. The problem is that almost none of the emotional triggers in your modern life require that kind of instant physical reaction. Yet your brain keeps responding as if they do. This is why so many people describe their emotional life as feeling like a hostage situation. They know, intellectually, that they shouldn't send that message, shouldn't make that purchase, shouldn't say that thing to their partner in the middle of an argument. And yet, in the moment, it feels like there is no space at all between the feeling and the action. The feeling arrives, and the behavior follows so quickly, it seems like a single event. This is exactly the illusion that emotional detachment shatters. The gap has always been there. It is just so small and so unused that most people never notice it exists. The same way a muscle that has never been trained feels like it simply isn't there at all. There is also a deeper trap hiding inside all of this, and it is one of the cruelest tricks the untrained mind plays on itself. Most people mistake the intensity of an emotion for the importance or the truth of it. If a feeling is loud enough, they assume it must be correct. If the anger feels overwhelming, they assume the other person truly deserves that anger. If the anxiety feels enormous, they assume the danger must be real and imminent. But intensity is not truth. Intensity is just volume. A feeling can be extremely loud and completely wrong about what needs to happen next. Learning to separate how loud an emotion is from how accurate its instructions are is one of the single most liberating shifts a human being can make, and almost nobody makes it because nobody ever tells them it's possible. Look closely at the people who seem to sabotage their own lives over and over. The ones who burn bridges in fits of anger, who make impulsive decisions they can never undo, who let a single bad mood destroy relationships that took years to build. In almost every case, you are not looking at a bad person. You are looking at an untrained nervous system, one that has never learned the difference between feeling something and obeying it. And here is the part that should give you real hope as you listen to this. If it is a trained response, it can be retrained. Nothing about this pattern is permanent. Nothing about it is fixed in your personality. It is simply a skill you were never taught, which means it is a skill you can learn starting today. This is where most self-improvement content stops short, and it is exactly where this audiobook goes further. It is easy to tell someone to just calm down, to just think before they react, to just let it go. That advice is useless without a mechanism, without an actual understanding of what is happening inside you in that critical window and how to intervene in it. So, in the next chapter, we are going to go under the hood. We are going to look at exactly what happens inside your brain and body in the moments before a reaction takes over. Because once you understand the machinery, you gain the ability to interrupt it, and that interruption is the seed from which every ounce of emotional detachment grows. Chapter 3. The Science of Emotional Hijacking. There is a term used by researchers to describe what happens when emotion completely overrides rational thought, and it is called an amygdala hijack. The phrase paints an accurate picture. Somewhere deep in your brain, a small structure shaped like an almond effectively seizes control of the ship, locks the captain out of the bridge, and starts steering the vessel according to a script written for a world that no longer exists. Understanding exactly how this hijack unfolds is the first real tool in learning how to prevent it, because you cannot interrupt a process you do not understand. Your brain processes threat information through two separate pathways, and the difference in speed between them explains almost everything about why emotional reactions so often outrun rational thought. The first pathway is fast and crude. Information from your senses travels almost immediately to the amygdala, which makes a rapid, rough assessment of danger and can trigger a full-body stress response in a fraction of a second, long before the more sophisticated parts of your brain have even finished processing what actually happened. The second pathway is slower and far more accurate. Information also travels to the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for reasoning, planning, and weighing consequences. But this route takes measurably longer to complete its analysis. What this means in practice is staggering once you really absorb it. Your body can already be flooded with stress hormones, your heart rate already elevated, your muscles already tensed for action, before the rational part of your brain has even finished understanding what triggered the response in the first place. You are not exaggerating when you say a reaction happened before you could think. In a very real, measurable sense, it did. The emotional brain got there first, and by the time your reasoning brain arrives at the scene, it often finds itself simply trying to justify a reaction that has already begun, rather than actually directing it. This is why willpower alone is such a weak tool against emotional reactivity. Willpower lives in the prefrontal cortex, the slow, careful, reasoning part of your brain. But during a genuine emotional hijack, that part of your brain is not fully online. Blood flow and neural resources shift toward the more primitive survival circuitry and away from the deliberate, thoughtful circuitry. This is why intelligent, disciplined people can still find themselves saying things in anger they would never say in a calm moment. It is not a failure of intelligence. It is a temporary and completely predictable shift in which parts of the brain are actually running the show. Now here is where the real power lies, and it is the single most important scientific fact underlying everything in this audiobook. That hijack, that flood of stress chemicals and narrowed reactive thinking is not permanent. Left completely unmanaged, it typically peaks and then begins to subside within a matter of minutes, sometimes less. The problem is that most people, having no awareness of this window, act during the peak, permanently locking in a decision or a statement made by the least reliable version of themselves. The entire discipline of emotional detachment can be boiled down to one core mechanical skill: learning to survive that window without acting, so that the decision gets made by the reasoning brain instead of the reactive one. This is where the concept of the pause becomes not just a nice piece of advice, but a precise, almost surgical tool. Even a delay of 10 or 20 seconds can be enough to allow the initial chemical surge to begin softening and to allow the prefrontal cortex to come back online enough to participate in the decision. This is why so many wisdom traditions across completely different cultures independently arrived at some version of counting to 10 before responding in anger. They did not have access to modern neuroscience, but they had observed, through generations of lived experience, the exact same window that brain imaging studies confirm today. There is another piece of the science that deserves your full attention, because it explains why chronic emotional reactivity does not just damage your relationships and your decisions in the moment, it actually damages your long-term capacity for detachment itself. Every time you allow a hijack to run its full course into action, you are strengthening the neural pathway that connects a particular trigger to an automatic reactive response. The brain operates on a simple principle of efficiency. The connections you use repeatedly become stronger and faster, while the connections you neglect become weaker. This means that a person who habitually explodes in anger is not simply expressing their natural personality. They are actively training their brain to explode faster and more easily with every single explosion. The extraordinary flip side of this same principle is where your hope and your power live. Just as reactive pathways can be strengthened through repetition, the pathway of pausing, observing, and choosing can also be strengthened through repetition. Every single time you feel the surge of an emotional trigger and manage to create even a small gap before you act, you are laying down a new neural pathway, one associated with control rather than hijack. At first, this will feel effortful, unnatural, even physically uncomfortable, because you are fighting against pathways that may have been reinforced for decades. But with consistent practice, this new pathway strengthens exactly the same way the old one did, until eventually, pausing before reacting becomes as automatic as the reaction itself used to be. This is the biological promise underneath everything we are building together in this audiobook. Emotional detachment is not a personality trait that some fortunate people were simply born with while the rest of us are excluded. It is a trained neural pattern, built through repetition, exactly like a muscle, exactly like a language, exactly like any other skill you have ever developed in your life. The calm, unshakable people you admire were not necessarily born calm. In many cases, they simply logged more repetitions of pausing before reacting than the people around them, until that pause became their default setting rather than their exception. Now that you understand the mechanism, it is time to build the actual practice around it. In the next chapter, we are going to go deep into that critical window between trigger and response, the pause itself, and I am going to give you the specific internal tools you need to actually occupy that window with intention rather than letting it slip past you unused, the way it slips past almost everyone else on Earth. Chapter 4. The Power of the Pause. If there is one single habit that separates emotionally detached, unshakable people from everyone else, it is this. They have trained themselves to live inside the pause, not to avoid it, not to rush through it, but to actually inhabit that small space between something happening and their response to it, treating it as sacred territory rather than an inconvenient delay. Everything valuable in this audiobook eventually funnels down into this one practical skill, because the pause is where detachment is actually built. Moment by moment, decision by decision. Let's be precise about what the pause actually is, because vague advice to just breathe or just calm down has failed millions of people, not because the advice is wrong, but because it is incomplete. The pause is the deliberate act of noticing that an emotional trigger has occurred, and then choosing to delay your outward response long enough for your reasoning mind to participate in what happens next. It is not suppression. You are not pretending the emotion isn't there, and you are not stuffing it down to deal with later. You are simply refusing to let it write the final draft of your behavior without your input. The first skill inside the pause is noticing, and this alone eliminates the majority of reactive damage most people cause in their lives. Most people do not even realize they are being hijacked until they are already 3 sentences into an argument they will regret. The moment you can catch the very first flicker of a trigger, the tightening in your chest, the heat rising in your face, the sudden urge to defend yourself or lash out, you have already interrupted the automatic chain. Awareness itself creates distance. The instant you can say to yourself, internally, I am triggered right now, you have stepped from inside the river onto the bank, even if only by a few inches. The second skill is the delay itself. And this is where most people fail. Not because they cannot notice the trigger, but because they do not know what to do with the space once they have it. A useful practice here is to give yourself a physical anchor, something concrete to do, instead of speaking or acting immediately. This might be as simple as taking one slow breath before responding to a provocative message, or silently counting to 5 before answering a question that has stirred up defensiveness, or physically leaving the room for 60 seconds before continuing a heated conversation. The specific anchor matters less than the discipline of always having one. Something automatic enough that you do not have to invent it fresh in the heat of the moment, because in the heat of the moment, your reasoning capacity is exactly the resource that is compromised. The third skill, and the one that transforms the pause from a simple delay into an actual tool of detachment, is the internal question you ask yourself inside that gap. This is where most people, even those who manage to delay their reaction, still fail, because they use the pause simply to build a more articulate version of the same reactive response. The question that changes everything is this: what does the calmest, most respected version of myself do right now? Not what do I feel like doing, not what would feel satisfying in this instant. What would the version of me that I actually want to become choose to do with this moment? This single question, asked consistently over months and years, will reshape your entire behavioral pattern, because it forces a comparison between your current impulse and your intended identity. And most people, when given that comparison, clearly choose the identity. There is a particular kind of power available to a person who has mastered the pause that is difficult to describe until you have witnessed it directly. In any negotiation, any conflict, any emotionally charged conversation, the person who is not rushing to react holds an enormous structural advantage. While everyone else in the room is operating from their fastest, least considered impulses, the person occupying the pause is gathering information, watching how others reveal themselves under pressure, and choosing their moment with precision instead of being dragged into premature action. Silence, in these moments, is not weakness. It is often read by everyone in the room as strength, Because instinctively, people sense that the person who is not reacting is the person who is actually in control. Consider how this plays out in a difficult negotiation. The party that speaks first after a provocative offer or a tense silence often gives away leverage, filling the void with a concession or a justification nobody asked for. The party who can simply sit inside the silence, observing, unbothered by the discomfort of the pause, forces the other side to reveal more of their position. This is not a manipulative trick. It is simply what naturally happens when one person has trained themselves to be comfortable inside a gap that makes almost everyone else desperately uncomfortable. The same principle protects you in far more personal situations. Imagine receiving a message from someone that stings, an accusation, an insult, a piece of unfair criticism. The untrained response is to fire back immediately, defending yourself in real time, often escalating the conflict and saying things that make the situation worse rather than better. The trained response, the one built entirely on the pause, is to notice the sting, to feel it fully without denying it, and to simply not respond until the initial charge has settled. In many cases, the message you would have sent in the heat of the moment and the message you actually send an hour later, once your reasoning mind has caught up, are almost unrecognizably different, and the second one almost always serves you better. It is worth being honest about something here, because I never want to oversell a tool to you. The pause does not eliminate emotion, and it is not meant to. You will still feel the anger, the hurt, the fear, the temptation, exactly as intensely as you did before you began this practice. What changes is not the intensity of what you feel, but the amount of control that feeling has over what you actually do. Over time, as this becomes more automatic, many people report that the intensity of their emotional reactions does gradually soften as well, not because they are suppressing anything, but because the nervous system, no longer being repeatedly slammed into full reactive mode, gradually settles into a calmer baseline. But even if that secondary benefit never arrived, the pause alone, practiced consistently, is enough to transform how your life unfolds, because it is not your feelings that create most of the damage in a human life. It is the unfiltered actions taken in service of those feelings. We have now covered what detachment is, why most people never develop it, the biological mechanism that hijacks their behavior, and the practical skill of the pause that interrupts that hijack. In the next chapter, we are going to take everything you have learned so far and apply it to the arena where emotional reactivity does perhaps the most silent, long-term damage of all, your closest relationships, because there is a very specific kind of strength required to love someone deeply while remaining emotionally sovereign. And almost nobody is ever taught how to build it. Chapter 5. Detachment in relationships. There is a particular kind of tragedy that plays out inside countless relationships, one that rarely gets named directly because it hides behind the language of love. It looks like devotion from the outside. It feels, to the person inside it, like proof of how much they care. But underneath, it is something far more fragile and far more dangerous to both people involved. It is the confusion of attachment with dependence. The belief that loving someone deeply means needing them completely, that caring about a relationship means your entire emotional stability must rise and fall with its condition on any given day. This chapter is about untangling that confusion, because it is one of the most important applications of everything we have built so far. Here is the uncomfortable truth that most relationship advice avoids saying directly. The healthiest relationships are not built between two people who cannot survive without each other. They are built between two whole, emotionally sovereign individuals who choose each other again and again, not out of desperation, but out of genuine desire. When one or both people in a relationship have not developed emotional detachment, the relationship itself becomes the primary source of their emotional regulation. Their mood depends on their partner's mood. Their sense of self-worth depends on their partner's approval. Their entire nervous system becomes entangled with another person's. And what looks like closeness is often actually a kind of mutual hostage situation where neither person can fully breathe without checking on the emotional state of the other first. You can usually recognize this pattern by its symptoms, even if the underlying cause is invisible. A person who cannot tolerate their partner being upset with them for even a few hours, who will say anything, concede anything, abandon their own boundaries entirely, just to restore the emotional temperature back to comfortable. A person who interprets every small shift in their partner's tone as a referendum on the entire relationship, spiraling into anxiety over a delayed text message or a slightly short response. A person who has quietly stopped pursuing their own friendships, hobbies, and ambitions because so much of their emotional bandwidth is consumed by monitoring and managing the relationship. None of these people are weak or foolish. They are simply operating without the skill this entire audiobook is built around. And the relationship is where its absence is felt most painfully. Now contrast this with what emotional detachment actually looks like inside a healthy relationship. Because I want to be extremely clear that we are not describing distance, coldness, or a partner who doesn't care. We are describing something almost the opposite. A person with real emotional detachment can fully show up for their partner's pain, sit with them through grief, anger, fear, disappointment, without becoming so entangled in that emotion that they lose their own footing. They can offer support without absorbing the emotional state as their own. They can say the difficult, honest thing when it is needed, because their sense of self-worth is not on the line every time a hard conversation happens. Their love is not diminished by this distance. If anything, it becomes more stable, more dependable, precisely because it is not constantly being hijacked by every emotional wave that passes through the relationship. One of the clearest places this shows up is in how a person handles conflict with someone they love. The undetached partner treats every disagreement as a potential catastrophe, because on some level, they believe that if this conflict is not immediately resolved, the entire relationship, and by extension their own sense of security, is at risk. This creates enormous pressure to smooth things over quickly, even at the cost of honesty. Or alternatively, it creates explosive escalation where every disagreement becomes a full-scale emotional crisis because the stakes feel existential. The detached partner, by contrast, can hold a disagreement with a kind of steadiness. They can say, "We disagree about this right now," and still trust that the relationship as a whole is not in danger. This steadiness is not indifference. It is precisely what allows real resolution to happen, because two people who are not panicking can actually think clearly enough to solve the problem in front of them. There is a particularly painful pattern worth naming directly, because so many people recognize themselves in it the moment they hear it described. It is the pattern of chasing. When a partner pulls away, even slightly, becomes quiet, needs space, or is simply having a hard day unrelated to the relationship, the undetached person often responds with escalating pursuit. More texts, more questions, more attempts to extract reassurance. This comes from a good place, a desire to repair connection, but it is driven by anxiety rather than genuine choice. And it very often produces the opposite of the intended effect, pushing the other person further away precisely because they can feel the desperation underneath the pursuit. The detached partner, when faced with the same moment of distance, can allow space to exist without panicking, trusting that connection does not require constant, anxious maintenance. And this trust, paradoxically, is often what allows genuine closeness to return far more naturally. It is essential to address something directly here, because this entire subject can easily be misunderstood in a way that causes real harm. Emotional detachment in a relationship does not mean tolerating disrespect, staying silent about genuine hurt, or pretending you don't care when someone treats you badly. That is not detachment. That is suppression. And suppression eventually curdles into resentment or explosive release. Real detachment means you can feel hurt fully, name it honestly, communicate it clearly, and still not need the other person's immediate validation or apology in order to feel like a whole, secure human being. You can hold a boundary, even an uncomfortable one, precisely because your sense of self does not collapse the moment the other person is unhappy with you. This capacity is, in fact, what makes people magnetic in relationships, though almost nobody frames it this way. Human beings are drawn, again and again, to people who possess a stable, secure center, people whose affection feels chosen rather than desperately needed. There is something deeply attractive about a person who clearly wants you, enjoys you, chooses you, but who would also be completely fine without you. This is not a manipulation tactic, and trying to fake it rarely works, because genuine security is very difficult to counterfeit convincingly over time. It has to be real, built through the same practice of noticing, pausing, and choosing that we have covered throughout this audiobook, applied specifically to the emotional triggers that arise in intimacy. If you take one thing from this chapter, let it be this: the goal is never to love less. The goal is to love from a place of wholeness rather than a place of need, so that your capacity for connection is not constantly at the mercy of another person's mood, availability, or approval. This is not a smaller love. It is very often a larger one, because it can withstand disagreement, distance, and difficulty without collapsing, and it frees the other person to be fully themselves, without the constant pressure of managing your emotional stability alongside their own. In the next chapter, we are going to carry this same principle out of the home and into the arena of career and business, where the stakes look different on the surface, but the underlying mechanics of detachment matter just as much, if not more. Chapter 6. Detachment in Career and Business. Walk into any high-stakes negotiation, any boardroom during a crisis, any startup in the middle of a funding collapse, and you will find the same pattern repeating itself. The people who survive, who come out the other side with their reputation, their resources, and their sanity intact, are almost never the ones with the most talent or the best original plan. They are the ones who could stay emotionally steady while everything around them was falling apart. Career and business are, at their core, arenas of constant emotional provocation. Disguised as spreadsheets and strategy decks, every rejection, every lost deal, every harsh piece of feedback, every betrayal by a colleague or a partner is an invitation for your emotions to seize the wheel, and the person who accepts that invitation over and over eventually finds their career defined by reactivity rather than judgment. Consider what happens inside a person who has never developed emotional detachment when they receive a piece of sharp, public criticism at work. Their face flushes, their heart rate spikes, their mind immediately starts constructing a defense, or worse, a counterattack. In the minutes and hours that follow, they may fire off a defensive email, vent to colleagues in a way that damages their own reputation, or withdraw entirely, becoming quiet and unproductive for the rest of the day, replaying the moment on a loop. None of this changes the criticism. None of it improves the situation. It simply adds a second layer of self-inflicted damage on top of whatever the original comment cost them. Now consider the same scenario with a person who has trained detachment. They feel the same initial sting because they are human, but they have built the internal architecture to let that sting pass through them without dictating their next move. They can sit with the discomfort, extract whatever useful information the criticism contains, discard the rest, and return to productive work within minutes rather than days. This distinction becomes even more consequential the higher the stakes climb. In negotiation, emotional detachment is not a soft skill. It is a direct source of leverage. The party who needs the deal to happen, whose emotional state is visibly tied to the outcome, telegraphs that need to the other side, whether through body language, tone, or the simple pace of their concessions. The party who can approach the table from a place of genuine detachment, who wants a good outcome but does not need this particular deal to survive, negotiates from an entirely different position of strength. They can walk away from a bad offer without flinching, because their identity and their security were never staked on this one transaction. This is precisely why the most successful negotiators are so often described as having ice in their veins. Not because they don't care about the outcome, but because their caring does not curdle into desperation. The same principle governs how people handle failure in business. And failure, make no mistake, is a guaranteed feature of any ambitious career, not a rare exception. The entrepreneur without emotional detachment experiences every failed launch, every lost client, every product that flops as a referendum on their fundamental worth as a person. This is exhausting in a way that is rarely discussed openly. It means that every single risk carries not just financial stakes but existential ones, which naturally makes a person more risk-averse, more defensive, and more prone to hiding failures rather than learning from them quickly. The entrepreneur with real detachment can hold a brutal, honest post-mortem on a failed venture without that honesty threatening their sense of self, precisely because their identity was never fused with any single outcome. This is not a small advantage. Over the span of a career, it compounds into a completely different trajectory. Because the detached person can take more informed risks, recover faster from setbacks, and extract more learning from failure, than someone who is too busy protecting their ego to look honestly at what went wrong. There is a particular workplace dynamic worth examining closely, because it shows up in nearly every organization, and it separates people who rise steadily from people who plateau despite genuine talent. It is the dynamic of office politics and interpersonal friction. The colleague who takes credit for your work, the manager who plays favorites, the peer who undermines you in subtle, deniable ways. The undetached response is to become consumed by these dynamics, to spend enormous emotional energy on resentment, on plotting quiet retaliation, on venting to anyone who will listen. This energy, spent this way, produces nothing of value and often leaks out into the quality of a person's actual work, since attention and emotional bandwidth are finite resources. The detached response is not passive acceptance of unfairness. It is the ability to see the situation clearly, decide on a strategic response, whether that means addressing it directly, documenting it, or simply outperforming it, and then executing that response without the corrosive drag of constant emotional rumination running in the background. Leadership itself is, in many ways, simply emotional detachment applied at scale. A leader who cannot detach from their own anxiety during a crisis transmits that anxiety to everyone around them. Because human beings are exquisitely sensitive to the emotional state of the person in charge, often reading it faster and more accurately than they process the actual words being spoken. A team facing a difficult quarter does not primarily need their leader to solve every problem instantly. They need their leader to remain visibly, credibly calm, because that calm becomes the emotional ceiling for the entire group, the reassurance that allows everyone else to keep thinking clearly instead of spiraling into their own panic. This is why the most effective leaders throughout history have so often been described using words like steady, unflappable, or composed under pressure. That composure is not a personality quirk. It is the direct, visible output of trained emotional detachment, and it is one of the most valuable, most trusted qualities a leader can possess. It is worth being precise here about a distinction that trips up a lot of ambitious people the first time they encounter this material. Detachment in career and business does not mean apathy toward results. It does not mean lowering your standards or caring less about the mission. The most detached executives and founders you will ever study are often obsessively driven, deeply invested in outcomes, willing to work relentlessly toward their goals. What separates them from the anxious, reactive version of ambition is that their drive comes from genuine desire and vision rather than from fear of what failure would mean about them as a person. They can pursue a goal with total intensity while holding, underneath that intensity, a quiet knowledge that they would survive its loss. This combination, fierce ambition paired with genuine emotional security, is exactly what allows a person to sustain high performance over an entire career rather than burning out after a handful of high-stakes years. There is a practical habit worth adopting directly from everything covered in this chapter. One you can begin applying the very next time your career presents you with a provocation. Before responding to bad news at work, whether it is a lost account, a harsh review, a cancelled project, or a public disagreement with a colleague, give yourself a deliberate window before you act. Ask the question introduced earlier in this audiobook. What would the calmest, most respected version of myself do here? In a professional context, this single pause, applied consistently over years, quietly becomes one of the most valuable career assets a person can build, because it means your reputation is shaped by your most considered responses rather than your most reactive ones. And in the long run, that reputation is what opens every future door. Chapter 7. Detachment in conflict. Every conflict, whether it unfolds across a dinner table, a boardroom, or a crowded street, follows a nearly identical internal logic, even though the surface details look completely different every time. Someone says or does something that feels like an attack. Your nervous system floods with the same ancient chemistry that once prepared your ancestors to fight or flee from physical danger. And in that flood, you face a choice, though it rarely feels like a choice in the moment, between escalating the conflict or de-escalating it. Emotional detachment is the single greatest determinant of which path a person takes. And understanding this dynamic in detail will change how you experience every disagreement for the rest of your life. Consider what actually happens inside most arguments between two undetached people. The first provocation lands, and rather than being processed calmly, it is immediately amplified by the listener's own emotional reactivity, distorted through the lens of past grievances, insecurities, and assumptions about intent. The response that comes back is rarely proportional to the original comment. It carries extra weight, extra sharpness, borrowed from every similar hurt the person has ever experienced. This escalated response then lands on the other person, who processes it through their own distortions and insecurities, and fires back something even sharper still. Within minutes, two people who may have started with a minor, resolvable disagreement find themselves in a full-scale emotional battle that has almost nothing to do with the original issue and everything to do with two dysregulated nervous systems, bouncing escalation back and forth like a tennis match neither side can stop playing. Now picture the same initial provocation directed at someone who has trained real emotional detachment. The comment still lands. It may still sting, sometimes quite sharply. But there is a gap, however small, between that sting and the response that follows. And inside that gap, something remarkable happens. The detached person can ask themselves what is actually being communicated underneath the provocation, what the other person might genuinely be needing or fearing, and what response would actually move this conflict toward resolution rather than escalation. This does not mean they become a doormat, absorbing insults without pushback. It means their pushback, when it comes, is chosen rather than automatic, precise rather than scattershot, aimed at resolving the actual issue rather than simply discharging their own emotional charge onto the other person. There is a specific phenomenon worth naming directly, because recognizing it by name gives you an enormous advantage the next time you encounter it. It is called emotional contagion, and it describes the well-documented tendency for emotional states to transfer between people in close proximity, almost like a virus jumping from host to host. Anger tends to provoke anger. Anxiety tends to provoke anxiety. Calm, remarkably, tends to provoke calm as well, though it usually spreads more slowly than the more urgent, high arousal emotions. This means that in any conflict, the emotional state of the most detached person in the room has an outsized influence on how the entire interaction unfolds. One person who refuses to be infected by the rising heat of an argument can, quite often, single-handedly pull the temperature of the entire conflict back down, simply by declining to add their own reactivity to the mix. This is precisely why the calmest person in any conflict so often ends up holding disproportionate power over how it resolves. It is not that they are more right or more skilled at arguing. It is that they have removed themselves from the escalation loop entirely, which forces the interaction to either de-escalate or to reveal itself for what it actually is. One person's reactivity crashing against a wall of calm rather than being met with matching reactivity. Anyone who has ever watched a skilled mediator work has witnessed this principle in action. Their power comes almost entirely from their refusal to be pulled into the emotional current of either party, allowing them to see the actual structure of the disagreement clearly while everyone else is submerged in it. There is an important nuance here that deserves careful attention, because without it, this entire principle can be misapplied in a way that causes real harm. Emotional detachment in conflict does not mean suppressing your own position, avoiding necessary confrontation, or pretending everything is fine when it genuinely is not. There are conflicts that need to happen, boundaries that need to be stated clearly and firmly, injustices that deserve direct, uncompromising confrontation. Detachment does not soften the content of what needs to be said. It changes the delivery mechanism entirely. A detached person can say an extremely difficult, even confrontational truth, but they say it from a place of chosen clarity rather than reactive heat. And this distinction, though subtle on the surface, changes almost everything about how the message is received and how likely it is to actually produce resolution rather than further escalation. There is also a particular kind of freedom available to a person who has mastered detachment in conflict, one that is difficult to appreciate until you have experienced it directly. Most people avoid necessary conflicts entirely, not because the conflict itself is unbearable, but because they fear their own inability to stay regulated once the conflict begins. They worry they will say something they regret, that they will be pulled into an escalation they cannot control, that their own emotions will betray them in front of the very person they are trying to confront. This fear quietly shrinks a person's life, causing them to swallow legitimate grievances, avoid necessary boundary setting, and tolerate treatment they should never have to tolerate, simply because the alternative, actually having the conflict, feels too emotionally dangerous to attempt. A person with genuine detachment does not carry this same fear because they trust their own capacity to stay steady inside the conflict, regardless of how heated it becomes. And this trust alone opens up an entire category of necessary confrontations that would otherwise remain permanently avoided. One final principle deserves to close this chapter, because it reframes how you should think about every future conflict you encounter. The goal of emotional detachment in conflict is never to win in the sense of dominating or defeating the other person. That framing itself is part of what keeps conflicts escalating rather than resolving. The actual goal is clarity, understanding the real issue underneath the surface friction, communicating your position honestly, and moving the interaction towards some form of resolution or, at minimum, mutual understanding, even if full agreement is never reached. A detached person measures success in a conflict not by who said the sharpest thing or who came out looking stronger, but by whether the actual underlying problem is closer to being solved when the conversation ends than it was when it began. This single shift in how you define winning will change the outcome of nearly every difficult conversation you have for the rest of your life. Chapter 8. The line between detachment and numbness. Every powerful tool carries with it the risk of misuse, and emotional detachment is no exception. There is a version of this skill that, taken too far or built on the wrong foundation, curdles into something genuinely harmful, something that looks similar on the surface but produces devastation rather than strength underneath. This chapter exists because I would rather you understand this distinction with total clarity than have you walk away from this audiobook accidentally building a wall that protects you from nothing except your own capacity for connection and joy. Let's define the danger precisely. Numbness is what happens when detachment is built not through deliberate training and genuine emotional processing, but through avoidance, suppression, and disconnection from feeling altogether. A person who has become numb does not experience less emotional pain in any real sense. They have simply stopped allowing themselves conscious access to their own emotional life. Which means the pain does not disappear. It simply moves underground, where it continues to influence behavior, physical health, and relationships from a place the person can no longer see or examine directly. This is an enormously important distinction, because numbness often masquerades as strength, and a great many people mistake their own numbness for the exact skill this audiobook is teaching, right up until it eventually collapses under sufficient pressure, often in ways that surprise everyone around them, including the person themselves. Here is a practical way to tell the difference. One you can apply to your own life honestly if you are willing to look closely. Genuine emotional detachment allows full access to feeling. A detached person can, if they choose to sit quietly and turn their attention inward, fully contact their grief, their anger, their fear, their disappointment in vivid and complete detail. They are not blocked from these feelings. They have simply built the capacity to choose when and how those feelings influence their outward behavior. Numbness, by contrast, involves an actual loss of access. A numb person, asked to sit quietly and examine what they are feeling about a painful situation, often finds very little there, a kind of fog or blankness where emotion should be, not because the pain has resolved, but because the pathway to consciously experiencing it has been shut down as a protective measure, usually one built in response to some earlier experience where feeling fully felt too dangerous or overwhelming to survive. This protective shutdown often has a clear origin story, even when the person experiencing it cannot immediately identify it. It frequently develops in childhood or in earlier periods of significant trauma, when a person's emotional environment did not have room for their full feelings, when expressing sadness led to punishment or dismissal, when vulnerability was met with ridicule, or when the sheer volume of pain in a person's early life exceeded what a developing nervous system could safely process while remaining consciously aware of it. In these circumstances, numbness is not a failure of character. It is an intelligent, adaptive response to an environment that genuinely could not hold the person's full emotional reality. The problem arises later, in adulthood, when the environment has changed, when connection and vulnerability are actually available and even desired, but the old protective numbness remains in place, now doing far more harm than good. The consequences of unexamined numbness accumulate quietly over years, and this is precisely what makes it so dangerous compared to more obvious forms of emotional dysfunction. A numb person often appears, from the outside, remarkably composed, even admirable, precisely because they never seem rattled by anything. But underneath that composure, relationships slowly starve for lack of genuine emotional presence. A numb parent struggles to attune to a child's emotional needs, not from lack of love, but from a genuine inability to access the emotional resonance that attunement requires. A numb partner leaves the person they love, describing them as distant, unreachable, present in body but absent in some more essential way. And the numb person themselves often experiences a persistent, low-grade sense of emptiness or disconnection from their own life. A feeling of going through the motions without ever quite touching anything real, even as their external circumstances may look entirely successful. If any of this description resonates uncomfortably as you listen, I want to be direct about what comes next, because recognizing numbness in yourself is not a life sentence. It is simply the necessary first step toward building genuine detachment in its place. The path forward involves deliberately, gradually, and often with real support, rebuilding conscious access to feeling. This frequently looks like the opposite of what a person expects when they set out to develop more emotional strength. Rather than pushing feelings further away, it involves leaning carefully toward them, often in small, manageable doses at first, learning to tolerate the discomfort of actually feeling grief, anger, or fear fully, rather than immediately reaching for the old habit of shutting them out. This work is frequently easier and safer with the support of a trained therapist, particularly when the original numbness developed in response to significant trauma, because reopening access to buried emotion without adequate support can feel overwhelming rather than liberating. There is a useful internal question you can ask yourself to distinguish, in any given moment, whether you are practicing detachment or drifting toward numbness. Ask yourself honestly, if I chose to fully feel this right now, would I be able to? A person practicing genuine detachment can answer yes. They simply choose not to let that full feeling dictate their immediate action. A person drifting into numbness often finds, when they actually try, that the feeling simply is not accessible, that there is a wall between them and their own emotional experience that they did not consciously build and cannot simply choose to remove through willpower alone. This honest self-inquiry, practiced regularly, is one of the best safeguards against accidentally building the wrong kind of wall while believing you are building the right one. The relationship between detachment and numbness can be summarized this way. And I want you to hold on to this distinction for the remainder of this audiobook, because everything that follows assumes you are building the healthy version rather than its damaging imitation. Detachment says, I feel this fully, and I choose my response. Numbness says, I cannot feel this at all, so there is nothing to choose. One is mastery. The other is absence. One expands your capacity for connection, resilience, and freedom. The other quietly diminishes your capacity for all three while wearing the same calm exterior. The remainder of this audiobook is dedicated entirely to the first path, and everything you practice from here forward should be measured against this single test. Does this deepen my access to my own feelings while giving me more choice over my actions? Or does it simply cut me off from feeling altogether? Only the first answer leads anywhere worth going. Chapter 9. The Ancient Roots of Detachment. The idea that a person can master their emotional responses without extinguishing their emotional life is not a modern invention packaged neatly for self-improvement audiences and social media captions. It is one of the oldest, most thoroughly tested ideas in human philosophical history. refined independently by multiple civilizations across thousands of years, each arriving at strikingly similar conclusions through completely different paths. Understanding this deep lineage does something valuable for the practice itself, because it transforms detachment from a trendy modern technique into what it actually is: a piece of hard-won human wisdom, tested across countless generations of lived experience. Consider the Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome, figures who developed one of history's most sophisticated frameworks for emotional mastery. Their core insight, distilled across centuries of careful thought, was a distinction between what lies within a person's control and what does not. External events, other people's opinions, outcomes beyond one's direct influence. All of these, the Stoics argued, lie outside a person's true control, and therefore attaching one's peace of mind to them guarantees a life of constant emotional turbulence. What remains fully within a person's control, they observed, is their own judgment, their own interpretation of events, and consequently, their own emotional response to those events. This is not a claim that external events do not matter or should not be engaged with fully. It is the far more precise claim that a person's inner peace should never be outsourced to things they cannot ultimately govern. The Stoic practitioners were not, contrary to popular modern misunderstanding, advocating for emotional suppression or a life devoid of feeling. Their writings, which have survived for nearly 2,000 years, are filled with rich, often deeply moving accounts of grief, love, and struggle. What they practiced instead was a disciplined habit of examining their immediate emotional reactions, asking whether those reactions were serving them or controlling them, and consciously choosing their response rather than being swept along automatically. This is, in essence, the exact same mechanism described earlier in this audiobook through the modern language of neuroscience. The pause between trigger and response, the deliberate choice of interpretation over automatic reaction, arrived at independently through careful philosophical observation centuries before anyone understood the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex. A remarkably similar insight emerged, entirely independently, within Buddhist philosophical traditions developing in a completely different part of the world. Central to this tradition is the concept that suffering arises not primarily from painful events themselves, but from a person's attachment to those events being different than they are, and from the mind's habitual automatic grasping at pleasant experiences while pushing away unpleasant ones. The practice that developed from this insight involves cultivating a quality of mindful awareness, observing one's thoughts and emotions as they arise without immediately identifying with them or being controlled by them, treating them instead as passing phenomena to be witnessed with equanimity rather than urgent instructions demanding immediate obedience. This is, once again, the same fundamental architecture: distance between observer and emotion, examined through an entirely different cultural and philosophical lens, developed across a completely separate historical lineage with no contact with the Stoic tradition of the Mediterranean world. Warrior traditions across numerous cultures independently arrived at closely related principles, though framed through the practical necessities of combat and survival rather than abstract philosophy. Historical accounts of disciplined martial traditions, from various samurai schools in feudal Japan to elite military training programs across many centuries and continents, consistently emphasize a state of calm, clear awareness under extreme pressure, often described using language that translates roughly to a mind like still water, capable of reflecting whatever approaches with complete accuracy precisely because it is not agitated by fear, anger, or panic. These traditions understood through the harshest possible practical experience that a warrior overtaken by emotional reactivity in combat made worse decisions and suffered worse outcomes than one who could maintain clear, detached awareness even while fully engaged in mortal danger. A lesson with obvious, if less extreme, application to the everyday high-pressure moments of modern life. What makes this convergence across such vastly different cultures, eras, and contexts so significant is precisely its independence. When multiple civilizations, separated by oceans, centuries, and completely different starting assumptions about the nature of reality, arrive at strikingly similar conclusions about how to master the relationship between emotion and action, this convergence itself constitutes powerful evidence that they were each observing something genuinely true about human psychology, rather than simply inventing a culturally specific story. Modern neuroscience, arriving thousands of years later, with brain imaging technology and controlled experiments, has essentially confirmed the practical wisdom these traditions developed through careful, patient observation of human behavior under pressure. There is something genuinely reassuring in recognizing this lineage as you undertake your own practice of emotional detachment. You are not attempting something novel or unproven. You are joining a very long line of human beings across an enormous range of cultures and historical periods, who each discovered that the space between stimulus and response is where human freedom actually lives, and who each developed disciplined practices for inhabiting that space more fully. The specific techniques may differ: meditation, philosophical reflection, disciplined training, but the underlying insight remains remarkably consistent across every tradition that has seriously examined this question. Emotional mastery is not about becoming less human. It is about becoming more fully in command of the very capacities that make you human in the first place. Your judgment, your values, your chosen responses, rather than being governed by the oldest, most automatic parts of your nervous system. As we move into the next chapter, we are going to translate this ancient wisdom, combined with the modern neuroscience covered earlier in this audiobook, into a set of specific, concrete, daily practices. Because understanding the philosophy and the science, while valuable, changes nothing on its own. What changes your life is consistent practice, repeated across enough days and enough moments of real pressure, until this ancient, well-tested skill becomes as natural to you as the reactive patterns it replaces once were. Chapter 10. Daily Practices for Building Detachment. Everything covered so far in this audiobook has built toward this single practical question. How, specifically, does a person actually develop this skill in their own daily life? Understanding the philosophy and the neuroscience creates the foundation. But foundations alone do not build a house. What follows in this chapter is a set of concrete, repeatable practices, each one designed to strengthen a different aspect of the emotional detachment we have been exploring throughout this entire audiobook. The first and most foundational practice is what might be called the daily emotional inventory. A brief period, ideally at the same time each day, spent honestly reviewing your emotional experiences from the preceding hours. This does not need to be elaborate. It can be as simple as a few quiet minutes, mentally or on paper, identifying the moments when you felt a strong emotional pull, whether toward anger, anxiety, jealousy, or any other intense feeling, and honestly examining how you responded in that moment. Did you pause, or did you react immediately? If you reacted, what would the paused, chosen response have looked like instead? This practice builds the skill of noticing, which, as covered earlier, is the essential first step inside the pause, and it builds it during a low-pressure, reflective moment rather than only during the high-pressure moments themselves, which makes the pattern far easier to learn. The second practice involves deliberately training your tolerance for discomfort in small, manageable doses, because a significant portion of reactive behavior stems not from the triggering event itself, but from an inability to simply sit with an uncomfortable feeling without immediately trying to resolve or escape it. This can be practiced through something as simple as noticing a minor irritation, a delayed response to a message, an unexpected inconvenience, a small criticism, and deliberately choosing to sit with the resulting discomfort for a full 60 seconds before taking any action at all. Not suppressing the feeling, simply allowing it to exist without immediately discharging it through words or behavior. Over time, this practice, applied consistently to small triggers, builds a genuine capacity to tolerate the larger, more intense triggers that inevitably arise in any full life. The third practice centers on what is sometimes called cognitive reframing, the deliberate habit of examining your automatic interpretation of an event and consciously considering whether alternative interpretations might be equally or more valid. When someone responds to your message briefly, your automatic interpretation might be that they are angry with you or losing interest, an interpretation that can trigger significant anxiety and reactive behavior. A deliberate reframe involves consciously generating alternative explanations. Perhaps they are simply busy. Perhaps they are dealing with something unrelated entirely. Perhaps their communication style is simply more terse than yours. This practice does not require you to believe the alternative explanation is definitely true. It simply breaks the automatic grip of your first, often most anxious interpretation, creating exactly the kind of cognitive distance that underlies genuine emotional detachment. The fourth practice involves regular physical regulation, because emotional detachment, despite being discussed throughout this audiobook, primarily in psychological terms, is deeply intertwined with the physical state of your nervous system. A body that is chronically under-rested, poorly nourished, and starved of physical movement is simply far more reactive and far less capable of accessing the prefrontal cortex under pressure, regardless of how much philosophical understanding a person has accumulated. Consistent practices such as regular physical exercise, adequate sleep, and even simple breathing exercises, practiced during calm moments, not just emergency ones, build a physiological baseline that makes emotional detachment dramatically easier to access when real pressure arrives. This is not a minor supporting detail. It is a foundational pillar that many people overlook while focusing exclusively on the psychological dimension of this skill. The fifth practice is deliberate exposure to controlled discomfort through chosen challenges, a practice that builds what might be called general emotional resilience rather than addressing any single specific trigger. This might involve activities that require sustained discomfort, difficult physical training, public speaking, engaging in respectful debate about topics where you hold a minority opinion, or any other activity that reliably generates some degree of manageable emotional intensity in a context where you have chosen to engage with it deliberately. Each time you voluntarily move through this kind of chosen discomfort without being overwhelmed by it, you strengthen the same underlying neural capacity that allows you to remain detached during discomfort you did not choose, the unexpected conflict, the sudden bad news, the unwelcome criticism that life inevitably delivers, regardless of your preferences. The sixth practice involves deliberately reviewing your identity and your sources of self-worth. Examining honestly which parts of your sense of value are currently tied to things outside your control, a particular relationship's approval, a specific career outcome, other people's opinions of you, and consciously working to build a more internally anchored sense of worth that does not rise and fall with these external variables. This is often the deepest and slowest of all the practices described in this chapter, frequently requiring genuine reflection, sometimes with the support of therapy or trusted mentorship, but it is also perhaps the single most powerful long-term investment a person can make in their capacity for emotional detachment, because so much reactive behavior ultimately traces back to a threatened sense of self-worth, rather than to the surface-level trigger itself. Finally, the seventh practice is simply consistent repetition of the pause itself, applied in real time, in real moments of genuine provocation, imperfectly at first, and with gradually increasing skill over months and years of practice. There is no substitute for this real-world repetition. Reading about the pause, understanding its neuroscience, even practicing it during calm, reflective moments, builds useful groundwork, but the actual skill is forged specifically in the heat of genuine triggering moments, when you notice the familiar surge of reactivity beginning to rise, and you choose, in that exact instant, to create space rather than immediately acting. Every single time you succeed at this, even partially, even imperfectly, you are laying down the neural architecture described earlier in this audiobook, strengthening a pathway that will make the next attempt somewhat easier than this one was. Take these 7 practices not as a rigid checklist to complete perfectly, but as a toolkit to draw from consistently, adapting them to your own life, your own particular triggers, and your own current capacity. Emotional detachment, like any genuine skill, develops unevenly, with periods of visible progress followed by moments where old reactive patterns reassert themselves, particularly under unusually intense pressure. This is not failure. It is simply the ordinary, non-linear texture of real skill development. And every person who has ever mastered this capacity, across every tradition and every century examined in the previous chapter, moved through exactly this same uneven process on their way to genuine mastery. Chapter 11. Detachment and the Architecture of Self-Worth. Underneath nearly every reactive outburst, every moment of emotional hijacking we have examined throughout this audiobook, lies a single hidden question, quietly running in the background of a person's mind, shaping their behavior far more powerfully than they usually realize. That question is simply this: does this threaten my worth? Almost every intense emotional reaction, when traced back to its root, connects to some version of this question receiving a frightening or uncertain answer. This chapter is about exposing that hidden architecture directly, Because building genuine, durable, emotional detachment ultimately requires building a sense of self-worth that does not depend on the outcomes, opinions, and events that detachment is meant to help you navigate. Consider why a piece of criticism at work can feel so disproportionately devastating to someone without a stable internal sense of worth. On the surface, the criticism is simply information, a data point about one piece of work on one particular day. But if a person's underlying sense of value is quietly tied to being seen as competent, as impressive, as beyond reproach, then that same piece of information lands not as a data point, but as a direct threat to their entire identity. The emotional intensity of the reaction is not actually proportional to the criticism itself. It is proportional to how much of the person's fundamental worth feels like it is riding on the outcome being evaluated. This is precisely why two people can receive nearly identical feedback and have wildly different emotional responses, one shrugging it off within minutes, the other spiraling into days of rumination and self-doubt. This dynamic explains something that puzzles many people the first time they consider it seriously. Why do external achievements, promotions, admiration, financial success, so often fail to produce the lasting sense of security that people expect them to deliver? The answer lies in the structure of externally dependent self-worth itself. If your sense of value depends on external validation, then every new achievement simply raises the bar for what future validation is required to maintain that same sense of security, while doing nothing to address the underlying architecture that made your worth conditional in the first place. This creates an exhausting, unwinnable treadmill, where a person can accumulate enormous external success while still feeling, underneath it all, perpetually one failure away from worthlessness. Genuine emotional detachment is essentially impossible to sustain on top of this kind of foundation, because the stakes of every single event remain existential regardless of how much external success has been accumulated. The alternative, an internally anchored sense of self-worth, operates on an entirely different logic, and understanding this logic clearly is essential to building it deliberately rather than hoping it simply arrives on its own. Internal self-worth is rooted not in outcomes but in something more stable: your own values, your own effort, your own character, as you understand and choose to embody it, regardless of how any particular situation unfolds. A person with this kind of foundation can still prefer success over failure, can still work hard and care deeply about outcomes, but their fundamental sense of being a worthy, valuable person does not hang in the balance of any single result. This is precisely the psychological soil in which genuine emotional detachment grows most naturally. Because when the stakes of any single event are no longer existential, the entire nervous system has far less reason to hijack behavior in response to it. Building this kind of internally anchored worth is not accomplished through a single insight or a single motivational realization, however powerful that realization might feel in the moment. It is built, much like the pause itself, through consistent, repeated practice over an extended period of time. One practical starting point involves deliberately identifying your own core values, the principles you actually want to embody, regardless of external circumstances: honesty, effort, kindness, courage. Whatever genuinely resonates as important to you personally, rather than values you have simply absorbed from other people's expectations. Once identified clearly, these values become a far more stable measuring stick for self-evaluation than any external outcome could ever provide. You can ask, at the end of any difficult day, did I act in alignment with my own values today? A question you have complete control over answering well, rather than did I succeed today? A question frequently influenced by factors entirely outside your control. There is a particular exercise worth practicing regularly that directly strengthens this internal architecture. When you notice a strong emotional reaction to some external event, a rejection, a piece of criticism, a comparison to someone else's success, pause and ask yourself honestly, what exactly about this event feels threatening to your sense of worth? Often, simply naming this hidden belief explicitly, out loud or in writing, dramatically reduces its power, because these beliefs typically operate most powerfully while remaining unconscious and unexamined. A belief like, if I fail at this, I am fundamentally inadequate, sounds obviously distorted and unreasonable the moment it is stated plainly, yet it frequently drives enormous reactive behavior while remaining entirely unspoken and unexamined in the background of a person's mind. It is worth being honest about the fact that this particular practice, more than perhaps any other covered in this audiobook, often benefits enormously from outside support, whether through therapy, honest conversation with trusted people in your life, or sustained personal reflection over an extended period. The beliefs that tie our worth to external outcomes are frequently laid down very early in life, often shaped by the particular conditions of approval and love we experienced as children, and unwinding them fully can be genuinely challenging work. This does not mean the work is optional if you want to build durable emotional detachment. It simply means you should approach it with patience, self-compassion, and, where needed, appropriate support, rather than expecting to complete it through willpower alone over a single weekend. As this internal architecture strengthens, something remarkable begins to happen across every other domain covered throughout this audiobook. The pause becomes easier to access because the stakes of any given trigger feel less existential. Relationships become healthier because your capacity to love is no longer entangled with your need for validation. Career setbacks become more survivable because your professional identity is no longer the sole foundation of your sense of worth. Conflict becomes less threatening because disagreement no longer feels like an attack on your fundamental value as a person. This is why this chapter sits where it does in this audiobook, not as an isolated topic, but as the deep-root system that makes every other skill we have covered dramatically more sustainable and more genuine, rather than a fragile performance that collapses the moment sufficient pressure is applied. There is one more layer to this architecture worth examining before moving forward, because it explains why some people can intellectually understand everything covered in this chapter and still struggle to apply it under real pressure. Self-worth built on external outcomes was very often, for most people, established extremely early in life, long before conscious reasoning had much say in the matter. A child praised primarily for achievement rather than effort or character absorbs, at a level far beneath conscious thought, the lesson that their value is conditional on performance. A child whose emotional expression was met with discomfort or dismissal absorbs the lesson that their inner world is somehow unacceptable or inconvenient. These early lessons do not simply fade with age. They become the quiet operating system running underneath adult decision-making, shaping which triggers feel existential and which ones feel merely inconvenient. often with very little connection to how a fully rational adult would rank the actual stakes involved. Recognizing this does not mean you are permanently bound by whatever conditions shaped your childhood. It means the work of rebuilding self-worth on an internal foundation is, in a very real sense, a process of consciously rewriting an operating system that was installed without your consent, using tools you did not choose, at a point in your life when you had no power to evaluate or reject them. This rewriting takes patience specifically because you are not simply learning something new, you are actively replacing something old and deeply automated, and old automated systems tend to resist replacement even after a person has consciously decided they no longer want to run on them. Expect this process to take real time. Expect setbacks, and measure your progress not by whether the old patterns have vanished completely, but by whether they are gradually losing their grip, showing up less often, with less intensity, and for shorter durations than they once did. Chapter 12. How Detachment Performs Under Real Crisis. Everything discussed throughout this audiobook so far has, to some degree, involved manageable, everyday emotional triggers, criticism at work, tension in a relationship, the friction of ordinary conflict. But the true test of emotional detachment, the moment that reveals whether this skill has actually been built or merely understood intellectually, arrives during genuine crisis, the sudden diagnosis, the unexpected financial collapse, the loss of someone irreplaceable, the emergency that offers no warning and no time to prepare. This chapter examines specifically how detachment functions and how it should function when the stakes are not hypothetical but devastatingly real. It is important to state clearly, before going any further, that emotional detachment during genuine crisis does not mean the absence of grief, fear, or devastation. Anyone who tells you that true emotional mastery means feeling nothing during a genuine tragedy is describing numbness, the exact distortion of detachment examined earlier in this audiobook, not the real thing. A person who has built genuine emotional detachment, facing a genuine crisis, will feel the full, appropriate weight of what is happening. The difference lies entirely in what happens next, in whether that overwhelming feeling completely disables their capacity to function and make necessary decisions, or whether they retain enough internal steadiness to keep acting effectively, even while the feeling remains present and real. Consider how this distinction plays out in a medical emergency involving a loved one. The undetached response often involves becoming so overwhelmed by fear and panic that clear thinking becomes nearly impossible. Critical information gets missed, necessary decisions get delayed, and the person in crisis ends up needing to manage not only the emergency itself, but also their own escalating emotional state on top of it. The detached response, and this is crucial to understand, does not involve feeling less fear. It involves feeling the fear fully, while simultaneously maintaining enough internal steadiness to ask the necessary questions, absorb critical information accurately, and make sound decisions under extraordinary pressure. This is precisely why medical professionals, emergency responders, and crisis counselors receive extensive training specifically focused on maintaining functional clarity while operating inside situations of genuine emotional intensity, because this capacity does not arise automatically, even in people who deeply care about the outcome. There is a specific mental practice that becomes enormously valuable during genuine crisis. one that draws directly on everything covered throughout this audiobook. It involves a kind of internal triage, consciously separating what requires immediate action from what can be processed and felt more fully later, once the acute phase of the crisis has passed. This is not suppression in the harmful sense described in an earlier chapter. It is a deliberate, temporary prioritization, recognizing that in this specific moment, fully processing the emotional weight of what is happening would actually compromise your ability to respond effectively, and consciously choosing to set some portion of that processing aside, with full intention of returning to it fully once the immediate demands of the crisis have eased. Many people who have navigated significant emergencies describe experiencing exactly this pattern, a kind of clear, almost calm functionality during the acute crisis itself, followed by a delayed, sometimes intense emotional processing once the immediate danger has passed and space finally opens up for the fuller feeling to arrive. This capacity for internal triage explains a phenomenon that often confuses people observing someone else navigate a crisis with apparent composure. Onlookers sometimes mistake this composure for a lack of caring, wondering how a person can appear so calm while something devastating is unfolding around them. In reality, this composure very often represents the highest possible form of caring. A person who cares enough about the outcome to prioritize effective action over immediate emotional expression, temporarily setting aside their own need to fully feel and express their fear or grief in service of doing whatever the crisis actually requires from them in that specific window of time. This is not coldness. It is often one of the most profound expressions of love and responsibility a person can offer during someone else's moment of genuine need. There is a crucial piece of this practice that deserves direct emphasis, because skipping it transforms healthy crisis management into the kind of harmful suppression examined earlier in this audiobook. The delayed emotional processing must actually happen. A person who consistently defers their emotional response during crisis after crisis, never circling back to fully feel and process what occurred once the acute danger has passed, is not practicing healthy detachment. They are accumulating unprocessed emotional weight that will eventually demand attention, often at an inconvenient or even destructive moment of its own choosing. Genuine crisis detachment involves a conscious agreement with yourself. I am setting this aside right now because the situation requires it, and I will return to feel this fully once I am able to. Honoring that second half of the agreement is just as essential as the first. It is worth naming directly that developing this capacity for crisis-level detachment is rarely accomplished through reading or intention alone. It is built, much like every other skill covered throughout this audiobook, through accumulated experience, ideally including deliberate practice during smaller, stressful situations, long before a genuine major crisis ever arrives. This is precisely why so many professions that regularly face high-stakes emergencies build extensive simulation and training programs, because the nervous system's capacity to remain functional under extreme pressure genuinely improves with repeated, graduated exposure to pressure, building the same neural pathways discussed earlier in this audiobook, strengthened specifically through the kind of high-stakes repetition that ordinary daily practice alone cannot fully replicate. If you find yourself, during some future crisis, unable to access the kind of composed functionality described throughout this chapter, extend yourself real compassion rather than harsh self-judgment. Crisis-level detachment represents an advanced application of every skill covered throughout this audiobook, and even people who have practiced extensively sometimes find themselves overwhelmed by a crisis that exceeds their current capacity. What matters most is the direction of your ongoing practice. Continuing to build this capacity through consistent daily application of everything covered so far, so that with each new challenge you face, however difficult, you carry a somewhat greater reserve of internal steadiness than you did the time before. Chapter 13. 2 Paths, 1 Choice. Throughout this audiobook, we have examined the mechanics, the science, the philosophy, and the practical application of emotional detachment across nearly every major domain of human life. In this chapter, I want to bring all of this together through direct comparison, examining 2 contrasting patterns of living that emerge from the presence or absence of this single skill, because seeing these patterns laid side by side often makes the stakes of this entire subject land with far greater clarity than abstract explanation alone can achieve. Picture 2 people, each facing an identical string of difficult circumstances across a single demanding year. Both lose a significant client at work within the same month. Both experience some degree of relational friction with someone important to them. Both face at least one moment of public criticism or failure that stings sharply in the moment. The external circumstances, in other words, are nearly identical. What differs entirely is the internal architecture each person brings to these events. And it is this internal architecture, far more than the events themselves, that determines the actual trajectory of each person's year. The first person, lacking developed emotional detachment, experiences each difficult event as a small crisis in its own right. The lost client triggers days of anxious rumination, defensive conversations with colleagues, and a lingering sense of professional insecurity that subtly affects their performance on the next several projects. Since the emotional residue from the loss has not been processed and released, but simply carried forward, coloring everything that follows, the relational friction escalates, because neither the reactive words spoken in the heat of the moment, nor the underlying insecurity driving them, were ever examined or interrupted through anything resembling the pause described earlier in this audiobook. The public criticism lands as a threat to this person's fundamental sense of worth, since their identity has never been anchored anywhere more stable than external validation, and it takes weeks rather than hours to metabolize, quietly draining energy and confidence that could otherwise have gone toward genuinely productive work. The second person, having built genuine emotional detachment through consistent practice over time, faces the exact same 3 difficult events across the same year and experiences something remarkably different. The lost client still stings, genuinely, in the moment. But the pause allows this person to extract whatever useful lessons the loss contains, communicate professionally rather than defensively with colleagues and the client themselves, and return to full productivity within days rather than weeks, because the emotional charge of the event was processed rather than allowed to fester unexamined. The relational friction, when it arises, gets addressed directly and honestly, precisely because this person's internally anchored self-worth allows them to have the necessary difficult conversation without it feeling like an existential threat to be avoided at all costs. The public criticism still lands with some sting, but it does not touch the deeper foundation of this person's sense of value, allowing them to extract the useful signal from the noise and move forward largely unburdened by the kind of prolonged rumination that consumes so much of the first person's energy and attention. By the end of the year, these two people, having faced nearly identical external circumstances, find themselves in dramatically different positions. The first person has accumulated a year's worth of unprocessed emotional residue, strained relationships that were never fully repaired, missed opportunities that arose during periods of reactive distraction, and a growing, exhausting sense that life consists of one crisis after another, each one somehow larger and more overwhelming than the last. The second person, having processed each difficulty in something closer to real time, enters the following year with far greater emotional and practical bandwidth available, having preserved far more of their energy, their relationships, and their opportunities across the exact same set of external challenges. This is not a hypothetical exaggeration designed to make a rhetorical point. This exact pattern, compounding across years and even decades, is precisely why some people seem to sail through the same category of difficulty that repeatedly derails others, and it has remarkably little to do with the actual severity of what each person faces. What makes this comparison so important is what it reveals about where your actual leverage lies in building the life you want. Most people spend enormous energy trying to control their external circumstances, trying to prevent difficult events from happening at all, trying to engineer a life free from loss, criticism, and conflict. This is, to a significant degree, an impossible and exhausting pursuit, since a certain baseline level of difficulty is simply an unavoidable feature of any full human life, regardless of how carefully it is managed. The far more powerful and genuinely achievable form of leverage lies not in controlling which difficulties arrive, but in controlling the internal architecture that determines how those difficulties, whenever they inevitably do arrive, actually affect you. This is precisely the leverage that everything covered throughout this audiobook has been building toward. Chapter by chapter, skill by skill. There is a compounding dimension to this comparison that becomes even more significant across a full decade rather than a single year. Relationships that are repeatedly strained by unprocessed reactivity tend to accumulate damage rather than simply resetting after each incident. Since trust, once eroded through repeated unpredictable outbursts, rebuilds far more slowly than it erodes. Career trajectories that are repeatedly interrupted by weeks of reduced productivity following each setback compound into a meaningfully different professional outcome after enough years have passed, even if any single interruption seemed minor in isolation. Physical health, too, bears the accumulated cost of chronic reactivity, since a nervous system repeatedly flooded with stress chemistry across years of unprocessed hijacking carries measurable long-term costs to cardiovascular health, immune function, and overall vitality. None of this is true of any single reactive moment in isolation. It becomes true only through the slow, compounding arithmetic of thousands of such moments, repeated across an entire lifetime, which is precisely why the practice described throughout this audiobook matters so much more than its modest, everyday appearance might suggest. You do not get to choose whether difficulty enters your life. Every person listening to this audiobook, regardless of how carefully or successfully they live, will face genuine losses, genuine failures, genuine conflicts, and genuine crises before their life is through. What you do get to choose, through the kind of consistent, deliberate practice outlined throughout this entire audiobook, is which of these two paths you walk through those difficulties The path of the first person, repeatedly derailed and depleted by circumstances outside their control, or the path of the second, genuinely feeling the full weight of every difficulty while retaining the internal steadiness to keep building the life they actually want, regardless of what any single year happens to bring. That choice, more than any external circumstance you will ever face, is what ultimately determines the shape of your entire life. Chapter 14. The freedom on the other side. There is a particular kind of freedom that becomes available to a person once emotional detachment has genuinely taken root in their life. And it is worth spending this chapter describing that freedom in full, because it is easy, across all the technical discussion of neuroscience and practice throughout this audiobook, to lose sight of what this entire skill is actually building toward. This is not a discipline pursued for its own sake. It is pursued because of what it makes possible on the other side, and that possibility deserves to be named directly and vividly. Consider first the freedom from the tyranny of other people's opinions, a tyranny that governs an enormous portion of most people's daily decisions without ever being named explicitly. Without emotional detachment, a person's choices, their career path, their creative expression, their relationships, their very sense of who they are allowed to become, remain quietly constrained by an ongoing, largely unconscious calculation of how each choice will be perceived and judged by others. With genuine detachment, this calculation loses much of its grip, not because the person stops caring what others think entirely. Some degree of social awareness remains healthy and important, but because their fundamental sense of worth and direction no longer depends on universal approval. This opens an entire category of authentic choices, career changes, creative risks, honest conversations that remain permanently foreclosed to someone whose every decision must first pass through the filter of anticipated judgment. Consider also the freedom from the corrosive habit of constant comparison, a habit that thrives specifically in the absence of internally anchored self-worth. Without detachment, another person's success can feel like a direct subtraction from your own, triggering a wave of quiet bitterness or anxious self-doubt every time someone else's achievements cross your attention. With detachment, another person's success remains simply that, their success, entirely separate from any accounting of your own worth or progress. This does not mean ambition disappears or that you stop noticing what others accomplish. It means those observations no longer carry the same power to destabilize your own sense of direction and value, freeing an enormous amount of mental and emotional energy that would otherwise be spent on a comparison that was never actually productive in the first place. Consider next the freedom from being controlled by other people's moods and behavior, a freedom that transforms every relationship a person holds. Without detachment, another person's bad mood, harsh comment, or unpredictable behavior can hijack an entire day, dictating your own emotional state as though you had no independent existence of your own. With detachment, you retain the capacity to remain steady and grounded, even when the people around you are not, which paradoxically often makes you a more stabilizing, more valuable presence in every relationship you hold. Precisely because your well-being is not simply a mirror of whatever emotional weather happens to be passing through the people around you on any given day. Consider the freedom from the exhausting cycle of reactive regret that consumes so much of the undetached life. The pattern of saying things in anger that damage important relationships making impulsive decisions that create lasting consequences, and then spending significant time and energy repairing or simply living with the aftermath of actions taken by a version of yourself that was, in that moment, not actually operating from your genuine values or considered judgment. A person who has built genuine detachment still makes mistakes. This skill does not confer perfection, but the frequency and severity of purely reactive, regret-generating decisions drops dramatically, because so many of the worst decisions any person makes across their lifetime occur specifically during moments of emotional hijacking that a trained pause could have interrupted. Consider the freedom to pursue ambitious goals without the accompanying psychological fragility that so often undermines ambition in people who have not developed this skill. A person can pursue a demanding career, an artistic vision, a significant relationship with full intensity and genuine investment while retaining enough internal detachment to survive the inevitable setbacks that any ambitious pursuit generates along the way. This combination, full engagement paired with genuine resilience to loss, is precisely what allows some people to sustain ambitious pursuits across entire decades, weathering failures that would completely derail someone whose identity was too tightly fused with any single outcome along the way. Consider, finally, the freedom to love fully, without the accompanying anxiety and dependence that so often distorts human connection. This freedom was explored in detail in the chapter on relationships earlier in this audiobook, but it deserves to be named again here as part of this larger picture of what genuine detachment ultimately makes possible. A person who has built real emotional sovereignty can love with their whole heart, invest deeply in the people who matter to them, and remain genuinely present through both the joys and the difficulties any relationship inevitably contains, precisely because their capacity for love is no longer bottlenecked by an underlying fear of loss or an unconscious need for the relationship to complete some missing piece of their own identity. This is the actual destination toward which every chapter of this audiobook has been pointing. Not coldness, not distance, not a life lived at arm's length from genuine feeling. The exact opposite. A life capable of feeling everything fully: the grief, the joy, the love, the disappointment, the ambition, while retaining full ownership over what that feeling is allowed to do with your one irreplaceable life. This is what unstoppable actually means, not the absence of difficulty, since difficulty remains an unavoidable feature of any life worth living, but the presence of an internal steadiness that no external circumstance, however painful or provoking, can ultimately take away from you once it has genuinely been built. Chapter 15. Where you go from here. We have covered an enormous amount of ground across this audiobook, and I want to use this final chapter to bring everything together into something you can actually carry forward and use, because understanding a skill intellectually and actually living it are two very different achievements, and only the second one will change your life in any way that matters. We began by redefining emotional detachment itself, clearing away the mistaken belief that it means coldness or indifference, replacing that belief with its actual meaning: the capacity to feel everything fully while retaining ownership over your response. We examined why most people never develop this capacity, trapped instead in a lifetime of reactive decisions driven by whatever emotion happens to be loudest in any given moment. We went beneath the surface into the actual neuroscience of emotional hijacking, understanding precisely why reactions can outrun rational thought, and precisely why that pattern, however deeply ingrained, remains genuinely trainable through consistent practice over time. We explored the pause in specific, practical detail, the single mechanical skill that underlies every other application covered throughout this audiobook. From that foundation, we applied this skill across the major arenas of a full human life. We examined how detachment transforms relationships, allowing genuine love without corrosive dependence. We examined how it transforms careers, providing the composure and resilience that separates people who thrive under pressure from people who are repeatedly derailed by it. We examined how it transforms conflict, turning the calmest person in the room into, quite often, the most influential one. We drew a careful, essential line between genuine detachment and its harmful imitation, numbness, ensuring you understand exactly how to build the version of this skill that expands your life, rather than quietly diminishing it. We traced this wisdom back through thousands of years of independent human discovery across entirely separate civilizations, grounding everything in a lineage far deeper than any single modern framework. We built a concrete set of daily practices designed to actually develop this capacity over time. We examined the deep architecture of self-worth that either supports or undermines everything else. And we looked directly at how this entire skill set performs under the pressure of genuine crisis, when the stakes are highest and the temptation toward complete emotional overwhelm is strongest. If you take only one thing forward from everything covered across this entire audiobook, let it be this. The gap between what happens to you and how you respond to it is the single most valuable piece of territory you will ever own in your entire life. Nearly everything that determines the actual quality and trajectory of your existence, your relationships, your career, your resilience, your sense of peace, gets decided inside that gap, moment by moment, choice by choice, across every single day you are alive. Most people never learn this gap exists, and they spend their entire lives being dragged along by whatever emotion happens to arrive first in any given moment, mistaking that reactive drift for the simple, unavoidable nature of being human. You now know otherwise. You understand that this gap can be found, entered, and gradually widened through consistent, deliberate practice, exactly the way any other genuine skill is built. You understand the specific mechanics of how to notice a trigger arising, how to create even a small amount of space before responding, and how to use that space to choose a response aligned with the person you actually want to be, rather than whatever your most reactive impulse happens to demand in that particular instant. You understand the deeper foundation of self-worth that makes this entire practice sustainable rather than fragile. And you understand precisely where the line sits between healthy detachment and the numbness that only imitates it while quietly causing harm. None of this transforms your life through understanding alone. It transforms your life only through repetition, applied specifically in the real moments of genuine provocation that your life will continue to present you with today, tomorrow, and for as long as you are alive. You will not execute this perfectly. Nobody ever has. There will be moments, even years from now, after extensive practice, when a sufficiently intense trigger slips past your defenses and pulls you into a reaction you did not choose. This is not failure. It is simply the ordinary, unavoidable texture of practicing any genuine human skill across an entire lifetime. And every person throughout history who has ever built real mastery in this domain across every tradition and every century, moved through exactly this same imperfect, non-linear process. What matters now is simply beginning, or if you have already begun somewhere across the course of listening to this audiobook, simply continuing. The next time you feel that familiar surge, the heat rising in your chest, the words already forming before you have decided to say them, remember that you are standing at the exact threshold this entire audiobook has been preparing you to recognize. In that single moment, you have a genuine choice available to you that most people never even know exists. You can let the surge write your next action for you, the way it always has before. Or you can pause, even for a single breath, and let the calmest, most grounded version of yourself decide instead. That choice, repeated across enough moments, across enough days, is what an unstoppable life is actually built from. One gap, fully owned, at a time.